Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman. So, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good afternoon from Doha, Qatar. This can be good morning or good evening for you, depending where you are. I welcome you all on behalf of the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, CILE, for this public lecture, Environmentalism and the Ecological Question in the Islamic Moral Tradition. This public lecture is a side event for a research seminar, an international seminar that we are organizing under the title Reassembling Creation, Green Ethics and the Scholarly Disciplines in the Islamic Tradition. It's a project led by Dr. Berget Kravitz, who will be with us today in this public lecture. She's one of the speakers, and she's taking lead of the project of the seminar and its forthcoming publication. Of course, the seminar is a closed event, so this is a discussion between the participating researchers, but in order to share the thoughts that and the ideas that we exchange during the seminar in a way accessible to the general public, we organize this side event, this public lecture or public seminar, to engage with all of you. Before I introduce the panelists or the speakers in this event, I would like to say that the whole proceedings of this lecture are available in both English and Arabic. There is a possibility for translation. You can find all the details in the note that you can find in the chat box, and you can also find in the Q&A books. So for those who want to follow, all the speakers will speak in English, but there is a possibility for translation in Arabic. If you allow me to say this also in Arabic, in case that we have anyone who does not know. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أرحب بكم في هذه المحاضرة العامة من محاضرات مركز دراسة التشريع الإسلامي والأخلاق. فقط أود أن أنوه إلى أن الفعاليات المحاضرة ومشاركات المحاضرين والأسئلة ستكون متاحة بالترجمة إلى العربية والإنجليزية. المعلومات عن الترجمة موجودة في الجزء الخاص بالشات أو المحادثة، وموجودة أيضا في كملاحظة في Q&A، سؤال وجواب. الإخوة المتحدثين والمتحدثات أو المتحدثات والمتحدث سيكون كل الكلمات باللغة الإنجليزية، وبالتالي من يرغب في متابعة الكلمات باللغة العربية يمكن له النظر في الملاحظة الموجودة في الشات أو المحادثات وفي السؤال وجواب. Okay, so now I will introduce the speakers in the order of their talk. So we will start with Naiyerah Kolkailah. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, and her current research is focusing on the influence of Islamic ethics on environmental thought and practice in Qatar. She has an interdisciplinary background. She did her BS and MS in biological sciences. She had a diploma in Islamic studies from our college, Islamic studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, and she is very active in the field of environmental and green ethics in the Islamic tradition. The second in the order of speaking is Dr. Berget Kravitz from Germany. As I told you, she's the one who's taking lead of the whole project of the research international seminar that we are organizing, and this event is a side event of this project. Dr. Berget Kravitz is a professor of Islamic studies at the Freie Universität or Free University in Berlin. She has been affiliated with many reputable universities around the world, including Germany. where she studied together with the famous Professor Joseph van Es, also with the United States of America, where she was affiliated with Princeton University, with Harvard University, and many other universities around the world. Dr. Berget Kravitz is also an editorial member of the Journal of Islamic Ethics, initiated by CILE, our research project and our research center, and published by CILE. Last but not least, we have Munjed Murad, who is a doctoral candidate at the Harvard Divinity School in the United States. His research is focusing on nature in Islamic and Christian traditions. He's also a graduate of the Yale School of the Environment, where he studied religion and ecology. If you want to know more about the speakers of today, or if you want to know more about the research seminar and its background, the main questions that we are addressing in this seminar, you can have a look on the website of CILE. You can easily find it on internet if you search CILE, C-I-L-E, Doha. You will find it on internet, and you will find information both about the seminar, about the speakers today, about this public lecture, and many other events that we organize throughout the year. Without further ado, I give now the floor to Naiyerah. Kolkailah. I hope I pronounce it right this time. The floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes. We will take all the lectures, so each 20 minutes, and then we have the engagement and interactive discussions with the audience. For the audience, please feel free to add your question, but please indicate clearly in your remark to whom you are directing the question. Please make use of the Q&A box, where you can always add your notes anytime during the lecture, and then I'll do my best to collect them all and communicate them to the respective speaker. Okay, Naiyerah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ghaly. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Krawietz and Dr. Ghaly and the rest of the CILE team for organizing this very important event and for inviting me to speak here today. So my presentation explores the ethical potential of gardens from a holistic perspective based on several Quranic narratives. And just to give you an overview of what I'll be covering, I'll briefly address historic gardens in the Muslim world, and then I'll discuss some theological and ethical principles and values derived from four narratives in the Quran featuring gardens and natural landscapes and non-human creation. And based on these principles, I propose an ethical framework for creating gardens that harmonizes theocentric, anthropocentric, and ecocentric priorities. Now, if you're not familiar with these terms, they're discussed in ongoing debates within Islamic and environmental discourses regarding who or what entity has moral standing or is most central or worthy of consideration in socio-environmental relations. And in a nutshell, some scholars adopt a God-centered approach, some adopt a human-centered approach, some adopt an ecocentric approach, where not just individual living creatures, but entire natural systems with their living and non-living components are considered most central and worthy of consideration. So that's just a background point. Then I try to bridge the theoretical and the practical by discussing how Islamic institutions, including mosques and charitable organizations, can use the proposed ethical framework in designing green spaces that contribute to fulfilling a range of spiritual, social, and environmental objectives. And although the focus is on gardens in this presentation, I'd just like to point out that this approach of harmonizing these kind of three seemingly different and divergent perspectives or priorities for creating gardens can really be applied more generally to our conceptualization, our attitudes and behaviors towards the natural environment. So we know that gardens have flourished under multiple Islamic dynasties and empires, from the Umayyads to the Ottomans, and these gardens were found across very geographically, culturally, and environmentally diverse regions, including the Middle East, the Iberian Peninsula, and Central and Southeast Asia. And many of these historic gardens, such as the Andalusian gardens in Granada and Cordoba, are a source of pride and dignity for many Muslims who like to kind of reminisce over the past glory of Islam that apparently manifested through these gardens.
Sorry, Naiyerah, sorry.
Yes. Yes.
The translators ask that it can be a bit slower.
Okay, I'll do
And
my
I'll be generous with time also. So
Okay,
if you can make it a bit slower, no
trying
problem.
to squeeze my
So that
presentation.
those who are following in Arabic can follow. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So I was saying that many of these, historic gardens like the Andalusian gardens and the ones in Granada and Cordoba and other cities like Seville, they're a source of pride and dignity for many Muslims. And we like to kind of, think about and reminisce over this past glory of Islam that, manifested through these gardens and their surrounding kind of architectural marvels. And garden historians have studied many recurrent features in these gardens, including geometric design, symmetrical patterns, water fountains, etc., that have been attributed to the influence of Islamic culture and civilization. And even though studying these features and forms is, I think, an important endeavor and shouldn't be undermined, I try to move beyond focusing on traditional motifs and architectural or artistic elements to explore the spiritual and ethical potential of existing or future gardens. And I propose that gardens can be reimagined as green spaces where Islamic principles and values and teachings derived from the Quran and Sunnah can really shape the broader objectives that these spaces aim to achieve, and also direct the ways that these spaces actively function and operate. And I think that taking this approach respects the vast, social, cultural, and environmental diversity that highly influences garden designs throughout the Muslim world, and at the same time deeply roots the purposiveness of these green spaces within a relatively unified Islamic worldview and ethical framework. Now, although many classical and contemporary Muslim scholars have written extensively on the theoretical conception and ideal treatment of nature and animals in Islam, one of the areas that hasn't received much attention, specifically in relation to creating gardens, is the spiritual and ethical value that can be derived from Quranic narratives that feature earthly gardens or jannat, fertile gardens, or non-human living creatures. So that's why I chose to highlight and discuss the implications of 4 Quranic narratives as they relate to creating earthly gardens. The first narrative, which is found in Surah Al-Kahf, is known by a lot of people. It's actually known by its antagonist, Sahab al-Jannatain, or the companion of the 2 gardens, although many lessons can be gleaned from the protagonist, who's a believer in this story as well. And just as background for this story, we see that this parable contrasts the mentality of a non-affluent believer with that of a wealthy disbeliever who owns these 2 lush and fruitful gardens graced with a flowing river between them. And right from the start, we see that the disbeliever uses his material blessings, his gardens, wealth, and manpower to assert his claimed superiority or self-sufficiency and over his companion. And he also fails to attribute his blessings to God. The poor believer, on the other hand, shows humility before God and his companion, and we also find him expressing hope for God to grant him a better garden than his companions. And he also warns the disbeliever of the possibility of God destroying his garden and making it barren and dry, which the Quran then affirms actually took place, leaving the disbeliever filled with sorrow over everything he invested in his gardens and regretting also that he associated partners with his Lord. Now, how is this relevant? We can take away a number of relevant theological and ethical lessons from this parable for the purpose of creating gardens for either public or private use. Based on this narrative, it's clear that a theocentric outlook is critical for any garden project to count as truly successful from a religious standpoint. And part of this theocentric approach entails recognizing that God is the ultimate owner and master who created life and death itself, and who causes seeds to split open, plants to grow, flowers to bloom, and plants to bear vibrant and nutritious fruits and vegetables. And attributing the beauty and bounty of gardens merely to personal merits or to successful environmental planning, farming, and gardening reflects an arrogant attitude, because it demonstrates the inability to recognize the divine hand and the ultimate force that controls everything in the created world and the natural laws that God used to design it. This Quranic narrative shows that this kind of ingratitude towards God's provisions has the potential to cause deprivation and removal of the very material blessings that ingrates rely on to claim superiority or self-sufficiency. Even in the hereafter, a lack of gratitude can also lead to permanent deprivation of the eternal garden reserved for the righteous. And at the same time, we know that God's promise in the Quran is to reward gratitude with increased blessings and provisions. And based on this Quranic narrative, it's implied then that the purpose of creating earthly gardens is not to flaunt one's social status or even political power, as has arguably been the case for royal gardens under some Muslim empires and dynasties. Rather, the primary purpose of establishing gardens is to cultivate faithfulness and humility before God, while creating a natural environment for people that stimulates deep contemplation and appreciation of the beauty and power of God that's revealed through the beauty and wonders and signs or ayat in his creation. And beside these theological and spiritual lessons, there's another parable in the Quran that points to some important socio-ethical objectives for establishing gardens. This second Quranic narrative is found in Surah Al-Qalam, and it tells the story of several brothers who most exegetes will say that they had inherited a fruitful garden from their father. Now, when he harvested his crops, the father would regularly share some of his produce with the orphans and the widows and the poor. But after the father's death, the brothers decided to end this practice, and they plotted to harvest the entire garden secretly so they wouldn't leave any behind for the needy. And these brothers were determined to execute their plan one morning until they discovered that their garden, along with their livelihood, was destroyed. And we find that in the first Quranic parable, the disbeliever's gardens were destroyed as a recompense for his disbelief and ingratitude and arrogance with respect to God, and also in relation to the poor believer, if you remember. In this second narrative, we see that the brothers were deprived of their crops and livelihood because they schemed to deprive the poor of their share, not recognizing that God is the one who truly gives and withholds. This second narrative also brings to the fore the ethical value of social justice and the importance of bridging the social and economic gap between the wealthy and the poor in society. The father's garden was initially a place where the poor came face to face with the relatively more privileged in society, and where an exchange of wealth in the form of produce took place between the rich and the poor and the needy. This second narrative illustrates the potential of gardens then to meet certain anthropocentric needs in society by functioning as physical spaces and institutions that prioritize the implementation of socio-ethical values, including justice, equity, and generosity. Gardens can also promote more compassion and unity in society by creating a space that brings together people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and by allowing the wealthy to interact with the poor and disenfranchised in society. This point is relevant for many societies today where the poor and needy have become invisible and spatially distanced from the wealthy, who often send their alms due or zakah or charitable donations, sadaqat, through Islamic organizations without ever even knowing the recipients or witnessing their condition. And beside the social benefits of gardens, giving underprivileged people access to green spaces can not only support their livelihood and uplift their financial state, but it can also enhance their emotional, physical, and mental well-being. So the goal in establishing gardens then would not be to create expansive and lavish natural landscapes that allow exclusive access to the wealthy elites in society while barring the less fortunate. Rather, gardens would act as one of the vehicles through which people can fulfill their role as vicegerents or khulafa by providing a social service and benefit to the poor and allowing people to cultivate a sense of humility and compassion towards others. The third narrative, which is found in the story of Joseph in the Quran, Yusuf alayhi salam, includes a series of events that are relevant to the creation of fertile gardens and landscapes in line with Islamic values. We know that when Joseph was in prison, he was consulted about the dream of the king of Egypt, in which the king saw 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean cows, as well as 7 green ears of corn and 7 withered ones. And based on Joseph's interpretation, his advice was to store what they harvest during the first 7 fertile years, except a small portion they would consume in preparation for the following 7-year famine. And this strategy would allow them to survive those 7 difficult years, which would be followed by 1 year filled with bounty and abundance. And when the king heard Joseph's interpretation, he summoned Joseph and he eventually entrusted him with managing the nation's storehouses. So what can we take away from this narrative? Joseph's advice in this narrative represents the value of long-term conservation and sustainability, particularly when faced with environmental crises characterized by drought and water or food scarcity. It also highlights the value of moderation in food consumption, especially when resources are scarce, as well as the benefit of growing food locally to avoid the financial and environmental costs of transporting food from a distance or importing food from neighboring regions. It's also noteworthy that Joseph shared his interpretation and advice out of a genuine desire to benefit people, even though the king of Egypt was not a believer, and the countless benefits that would result from implementing his strategy would also serve many people who were not believers. So Joseph's example demonstrates the value of Muslims involved in any kind of environmental planning, farming, or gardening to develop environmentally sustainable projects that enhance the livelihood of their local people, irrespective of their faith, culture, or ethnic background. And as we also see from Joseph being granted a noble position in this story, virtuous acts that benefit other people have the effect of increasing the reward and blessings for believers, both in this life and the hereafter. The fourth Quranic narrative found in Surah An-Naml, which incidentally is named after the creature highlighted in the story, recounts an incident that happened with Solomon after Sulaiman alayhi salam, as you know him as well, after he marshaled his forces, which included jinn, people, and birds. As he and his forces marched forward, they came across a valley of ants. Solomon overheard one ant warning the others, "O ants, enter your dwellings quickly, lest Solomon and his soldiers crush you unknowingly." And understanding the ants' communication made Solomon smile as he admired the ants' concern for its community, and he also felt incredible gratitude to God for allowing him to understand the ants' language and through that avoid harming its colony. And this narrative demonstrates the gentleness and mercy and sensitivity that's needed when designing gardens that can nurture living communities inhabiting or frequenting the same locality. And these communities, which the Quran likens to human communities, consist of individuals that care for each other and communicate so they can sustain and protect their kind. Solomon understood the language of the ants and birds, but since other people can't understand them, the Quran also reveals to humanity that everything glorifies God's name. And based on these spiritual and physical realities, all living creatures are considered intrinsically valuable, irrespective of their utility to human beings, and also worthy of care and respect. So gardens can play a significant role in not only protecting God's living creatures from harm, but also in creating landscapes and lush habitats that make food, water, shelter, and shade available for birds, insects, and other living creatures. Adopting an ecocentric approach to garden design and environmental planning directs the focus on promoting safe havens and healthy ecosystems that can sustainably support living communities thriving with biodiversity. And when garden projects aim to fulfill these ecocentric objectives in order to please God, while safeguarding his signs in nature and his creation's praises of him, this work becomes an embodiment of thanks and gratitude for the ability to serve God's living creatures. So taken together, these Quranic narratives reveal the value of adopting a multifaceted framework for gardens that harmonizes theocentric, anthropocentric, and ecocentric approaches to socio-environmental relations and environmental planning. And when combined with other Quranic and prophetic principles and directives, the values that we can glean from these Quranic parables and narratives converge to create a holistic ethical framework for designing gardens that prioritizes first and foremost faithfulness to the owner and giver of life, expressing gratitude for his blessings and provisions, and affirming his creative power and divine beauty witnessed through his natural signs. This framework requires a balanced approach to inculcating humility before God and his creation, serving human and non-human creatures, and investing in the establishment of sustainable ecosystems and habitats that allow living communities to flourish with balance and harmony. And I want to take a few moments, or a few more minutes, if that's okay, to say a few words here about Islamic institutions, including mosques or charitable organizations, so we can think of possible ways to apply some of these ideas on the ground. I think Islamic institutions have a lot of potential when it comes to creating gardens based on the framework that I just proposed. As Islamic institutions, these entities would ideally design spaces that facilitate the actualization of spiritual and ethical principles and values from the Quran and Sunnah related to people's relationship with human and non-human creation. And these, Islamic institutions can really assess the most urgent social, environmental, and economic needs of their community and determine priorities based on those needs. And one example is if many people in the neighborhood or city or region suffer from hunger or food insecurity, they can educate their members about those needs, produce extra crops, and regularly invite the poor and needy to collect a particular allotment of produce free of cost. And this practice would help actualize many Islamic values related to justice, mercy, equity, compassion, charity, generosity, and while also increasing unity and humility within the community. If the locality has minimal green open spaces, gardens created by Islamic institutions can also serve as physical and spiritual havens for all people from heavily urbanized and industrialized cities. Providing access to these gardens, I think, can be a form of islah, or rectification of the imbalance that we often see between the built and the natural environment that exists in so many places. Gardens can also be designed to facilitate individual seclusion in nature, where people have the opportunity to experience nature's therapeutic effects through complete immersion and stimulation of their senses. They can find peace and tranquility under the canopies of shade trees, for example, and find comfort in the singing of the birds and splashing water in fountains or streams, and hearing how the wind speaks to the trees. And they can relax with, the aromas of fragrant plants and flowers filling the gardens, and also taking time to admire the beautiful, vibrant colors of all kinds of flowers. And we know from past research that giving people the opportunity to immerse themselves in nature has many personal benefits. There's so many, including reducing stress, strengthening immune and cardiovascular systems, uplifting people's mood, contributing to a mental relaxation and psychological healing, and also increasing feelings of awe and selflessness and gratitude. So these gardens can play a major role in contributing to the common good, or maslaha, and advancing the individual and collective well-being for people from all segments of society. When it comes to ecocentric priorities, gardens created by Islamic institutions can also serve as educational hubs that increase people's understanding of the value of green spaces and tree planting, for example, and mitigating climate change and regulating land temperatures. These environmental practices can also be perceived as ways for people to contribute to preserving God's signs and restoring the balance in his creation. And, gardens can also focus on protecting the diversity that God created in nature and cultivating endangered plants and, shrubs and herbs that attract vulnerable species and pollinators, like bees and birds and butterflies, for example. All these horticultural activities can be coupled with, some scientific and educational programs that aim to highlight the ecological role of certain plants within broader ecosystems. In terms of practical influence also for people, I think, these institutions can organize workshops and demonstrations to educate people about how to garden effectively, how to eat seasonally, or practice composting, for example, to preserve natural resources, improve nutrient recycling, and decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by preventing food and organic waste from ending up in landfills. I think framing these practices as ethical imperatives in line with Quranic and prophetic principles, advocating conservation, moderation, and avoiding wastefulness reinforces really how inextricably linked people's human behavior is with the divine balance in God's creation and the broader fate of global ecological systems. And I think ecocentric initiatives in gardens initiated by Islamic institutions can really be a great opportunity for Muslims and their allies to counteract the corruption of the earth, or if said, after it's been rectified and made right, as the Quran tells us, and to honor and nurture the interconnectedness and fraternal bonds between living communities with abundant love, respect, and humility. So to summarize, my aim with this presentation is to expand the discourse on gardens in Muslim world beyond traditional motifs and recurrent architectural features of historic gardens, to explore the potential theological and ethical dimensions of existing or future gardens. And based on the principles and values derived from the 4 Quranic parables that I described earlier, I demonstrate the feasibility of adopting a balanced and holistic approach to the benefits and services that gardens can provide. And I think future studies can continue to explore the spiritual and ethical potential of gardens and green spaces based on Quranic narratives and prophetic stories mentioned in the Hadith literature. And I think many principles and lessons can be drawn from these narratives that really support a more service-oriented as opposed to hierarchical approach to the human role of Khalifa on earth, which can really help redirect social and socio-environmental relations toward a path of healing and rectification and mutual benefit, and ultimately beautify these relations with more humility and harmony and peace. So I will end there. Thank you very much. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you. Thank you, Naiyerah. Thank you so much. Dr. Birgit, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
I do not have a content-specific talk in the conference that I could share with you, but I do have a few remarks about mapping Islamic environmentalism. First of all, thank you for taking an interest in our workshop on green ethics and the scholarly disciplines in the Islamic tradition. I'm very thankful to Dr. Ghaly and his magnificent team for making the conference possible. With their professional expertise, they have greatly eased its preparation. Dr. Ghaly and I had drafted a background paper to this conference in order to drum up interesting submissions. That paper is available on the internet, so that there is no need to repeat here what we already wrote there. However, within the 20 minutes assigned to me, I want to talk about 4 main points. First, to quickly restate the main purpose of this enterprise. Second, I take the opportunity to give you a more detailed idea of what kind of papers were accepted in response to our call. Third, I venture some interpretation of the patterns of the broader response, while paying attention also to the non-responses. And fourth, I finally want to tell you how that relates to our declared aim of mapping, as indicated in the current title of my short presentation. As for the general idea of this workshop, for decades there has been a growing interest in the ecological question, also in connection with Islam. We already have an impressive number of edited volumes, articles, and of several monographs about the idea of an Islamic Green Deal. Meanwhile, long bibliographies emerging in this field of research attest to its relevance and vitality. Furthermore, there are all sorts of initiatives, movements, and institutions that invoke the green Islamic heritage. In 2021 alone, there are a considerable number of international and interdisciplinary meetings taking place that also involve broader Islamic studies and that tackle the field from slightly or greatly differing perspectives. Given the social pressure concerning climate change, many such contributions try to directly address that problem. However, this workshop does not aim to narrow its environmental concerns down to the challenge of sustainability. In that sense, our enterprise does not have a fixed ideological agenda, but wants to move into the open. Therefore, we problematize the idea of environment from a historical perspective. In fact, there are quite different answers as to what constitutes an environment and how environment is negotiated in the different scholarly genres or disciplines. That is not to diminish the gravity of the global problem of environmental pollution and exploitation, but it is perhaps advisable in terms of an Islamic ethics that we apply a less policy-driven and broader angle. What we do not want is a quick jump that easily equates Quranic terms like al-mizan with ecological balance, al-fasad fil ard with environmental pollution, etc., or that takes for granted simplistic announcements like we Muslims have always been green, even claiming we are greener than green. Such forms of self-congratulation are not helpful, but to my mind even express a lack of respect for the Islamic heritage. Quick jumps of that type run the risk of practicing some kind of tafsir ilmi, a meanwhile outdated trend of modernist scientific Quran interpretation. The utterly rich and variegated Islamic heritage deserves better than that. However, by referring to the scholarly disciplines in the Islamic tradition as invoked in the title of the workshop, we are not only reaching out for research in written texts of intellectual history, but also for practical responses to and appropriations of those traditions. That also includes expressions in material culture, notably garden design, and even the arts. I come to the second point. I want to briefly present those projects that successfully responded to our call. We're happy to have two fundamental papers on green messages in the Quran, namely Naiyerah Kolkailah, to whom you just listened, and the second immediately Quran-related paper is by Mohammed Shafir Kapi, Al-Ashjar wa Thamar fil Jannah wa Nar, wal-Akhlaq al-Mustanbata minha, the trees and fruits in paradise and hell, and the ethical lessons derived from them. Shafir Kapi takes stock of the various plant species in the hereafter and gives us plenty of food for thought. The plant dimension will be supplemented on day 3 by Islamic ethics and the non-human other, the religious life of nature in the Sirah and the Masnavi, by Munjed Murad, who is luckily also active with us in this public lecture today. That corresponds with our workshop credo of reassembling creation that pays much attention to plants, animals, and notably elements of nature in the outer world that are usually thought of as unanimated, but that emerge in many narratives as agents of sorts. Of course, many other genres are also rooted in or refer creatively back to the holy sources of Islam, be it Qisas al-Anbiya, and we have had a talk by Patrick Franke on Al-Khidr, but he's using a much broader variety of genres to complement that, and another talk about prophetic medicine by the expert for traditional Arab medicine, Ayman Yassin Adhad. Furthermore, there has been a talk on cosmological writing and geography by Samira Ibrahim, and Hazim Asghari has spoken on tracts on agriculture, Filaha. Two of our contributors directly relate to certain emic Islamic concepts, namely fitra in the case of Islamic moral discussions on bodily modifications that will be presented by Ayman Shabana on day 3. The second concept invoked in the title of a workshop paper that is that of the Khalifa, dealt with by Attilio Petruccioli and Agatino Rizzo, who will speak about green ethics and the struggle for contemporary sustainable urbanism. The aforementioned impression that there is too much human self-celebration and lack of self-criticism was tackled today in the talk by Marita Fuhrer-Haug, who spoke about Muslim eco-theological thought on waste and frugality in relation to the phenomenon of modest fashion. To continue this short presentation of conference contributions, there are 3 papers dealing with Islamic philosophy, notably the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa and Ibn Sina. However, I skip the exact titles because the composition for this public lecture does not include one scholar from this philosophical triad. In addition, we have 3 case studies and one latecomer is not even noted in the program in order to discuss how principles and practices of the Islamic scholarly tradition are implemented or transformed in certain initiatives or institutions. Laura Wikström deals with a certain German environmental organization, and the other case study turns to a research project at a mosque in Vienna by Ursula Fatima Kowanda Yassin. Whereas Muhammad Hassan Basri presents a certain Islamic religious school with a green vision in Indonesia. We not only welcome senior scholars in this workshop, but are happy also to see a large number of doctoral students. Obviously, the current environmental crisis alarms a high percentage of early career scholars who, however, bring fascinating new twists to the debate. Third, when I try to deduce some patterns from the overall responses to our conference call, it turns out that some disciplines of the Islamic scholarly tradition are perceived as much more forthcoming than others with regard to green ethics. I also see parallels between application patterns to our call and the already existing secondary literature. Let me mention a couple of these observations. Certain Quranic terms have been taken as overarching theological concepts. They are all over the place and inform a broad array of disciplines. However, there is not much effort to properly historicize their development over time. The second observation is the philosophical Vanguardism in the green ethics debate that is astounding, and that is not yet matched by most of the other scholarly Islamic disciplines, theology apart. Furthermore, there is a rising criticism of the strong religious paradigm of the Islamic garden. On the one hand, the label Islamic gardens is relativized, perhaps even criticized as Orientalism. On the other, a scholar like Kolkailah, whom you have just heard, tries to breathe new life into it. In addition, the importance of the imaginary in Islamic cultural history is very much on the rise, with repercussions for the study of Islamic ethics. The engagement with the imaginary and metaphorical thinking is in no way confined to popular Islam or genres like Qisas al-Anbiya, but is a much more widespread phenomenon with traces even in Islamic philosophy. Furthermore, there is a wider anthropological turn that shifts the focus to various sorts of case studies. Green Mosque and other initiatives are not automatically dealt with only by scholars from cultural anthropology, but also by many others, such as scholars in Islamic studies and political sciences, so that so-called field research is no longer owned by anthropologists. I now want to move on to what, negatively speaking, seems to be missing or has not been sufficiently analyzed. Whereas most of our main wishes, as stated in the background paper, have been covered by applications for the conference, one of the 6 key questions and cross-cutting topics has been met nearly with silence, namely the role of invisible creatures, especially jinn. This is all the more astonishing because narratives about jinn bring in the dimension of criticism of the behavior of humans and of their engagement with the environment. This potential has been widely overlooked in contemporary scholarship about jinn and in the writings about green questions. I only mention a half a dozen avenues of investigation that should be explored in future. First, mismanagement, facade, and dethroning of jinn as prior Khalifa on earth. They are understood as jinn are understood as a pre-Adamic species that spilled too much blood and enraged God. Second, jinn as experts of barren lands, heat islands, and waste spaces. They are said to be barred to barren lands, often deserts. Third, they defy the human-animal divide. They can at times become invisible. As shapeshifters, they can appear as certain animals. Fourth, at times they are shown as doorkeepers of natural resources, notably water and metals. Fifth, they seem to be experts of waste management. They often roam the outskirts of human dwellings and try to sneak leftovers. And finally, sixth, monitoring bad micro practices of humans make jinn to age-old witnesses of human activities, whom they punish. I want to give you now a second example, beyond jinn, of what is largely missing. Concerning the traditional scholarly disciplines of Islam that shall be assembled here is one otherwise utterly prominent low performer. A certain normative deficit can be diagnosed. There is a rather meager scholarship of green ethics in fatwa literature and in the yet to be seriously explored subfield of ecological jurisprudence, fiqh al-bi'a in general. We do have a number of monographs, but they are not very convincing. Fatwas are usually regarded as an indicator of vivid societal discussions, but ecology fatwas do not really seem to represent a really high tide. Their occurrence is minimal, especially compared with Islamic medical ethics. Some issues like correct slaughtering or halal food in general may be regarded as an exception. Furthermore, it is astonishing that the question whether environmental concerns might need special tools of usul al-fiqh is usually not even raised. That is to say, the jurisprudential or rather normative field still needs a thorough exploration and mapping. Personally, I think that it will not be enough to put the maqasid al-sharia in a green deen framework. Hence, I come to my fourth and final point. What do we mean by mapping? In a way, the method of a thorough and historically informed mapping that always takes a variety of disciplines of Islamic knowledge production into account and sets them in relation to some core issues or problems is the very trademark of the Islamic ethics initiatives under the guidance of Dr. Ghaly. To start with, different scholarly disciplines need to be identified to understand green ethics as a wide-ranging topic. Afterwards, it is worthwhile to watch out for all sorts of combinations, such as the paper of Munjed, who brings the seerah of the Prophet together with Persian poetry. A closer look at the other participants in the workshop and beyond reveals that there are all sorts of influences and connectivities possible. Furthermore, mapping implies that it is relevant to see what different kinds of methodological approaches have led to an Islamically informed engagement with nature and the environment. On yet another level, it is important to see what kinds of theoretical concepts are applied by current researchers who deal with the broader issue. The title of our background paper already alludes to the French sociologist Bruno Latour and his book titled Reassembling the Social, an Introduction to Actor Network Theory. The so-called ANT, as it is called, dissolves the familiar distinctions between subjects and allegedly mere objects. To conclude, the advantage of the metaphor of a map is that we revisit allegedly familiar disciplines of Islamic writing and activities. We do not take the existing secondary literature for granted as the high ground to build on. Taking a look at it, one could get the impression of a well-charted terrain. However, we want to enable ourselves to perceive blank spots and areas. It is programmatic not to be content with what we have, but to imagine what might be missing. This shall help to also develop new sets of questions. Wallahu a'lam.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now to the last, again but not least, talk today. Munjed, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Can you hear me?
Yes. You want to share a PowerPoint or something?
I Unfortunately, I don't have as beautiful images as Ms. Kolkailah does. Rather than lush green gardens, you'll be looking at me
No problem.
instead.
Okay, please go ahead.
In my short presentation, I'll also be speaking to the title of this lecture, of this panel, mapping out the field of Islamic environmentalism. And I'll be focusing on particularly the origins of the field, but presenting a tertiary of past, present, and future. Now, why do so? Well, for one, as they say in America, you do not know where you are going until you know where you have been. And it's worth mentioning that every science, every tradition, and let's stick to the Islamic tradition, the genius of the Islamic tradition is that it built upon what it received and provided for the next generation, and that built upon it. The great Islamic sciences and cosmologies are really a flowering of revelatory teachings expounded through centuries of development and exposition. And I think we could learn something from the Islamic tradition, as well as just generally traditions in general, by looking at what has preceded in order to know where we are and where we can go, and to also build on what has preceded. So looking first at the past, of course, the topic of the environment is largely, the focus on the environment is largely a modern phenomenon for religions in general. And that's because there was no ecological crisis, no environmental crisis prior to the modern age, of course. And it's worth mentioning here that the start of the Islamic response to the environmental crisis coincides, really by definition, with the start of the religious response to the environmental crisis. The first response, the highlighting of the religious dimensions, or say the spiritual dimensions of the environmental crisis, was penned by Sayyid Hussein Nasr in the 1960s with his famous lectures, the Rockefeller lectures, part of the Rockefeller series, that later turned into the book Man and Nature, The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man. And I have collected here a few books as I go through this history of the field. So here, this is a newer edition of it, Man and Nature, The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man. This is significant, and it's not an attempt to self-congratulate and unnecessarily so, but rather just an important fact for the field of Islam and ecology, that religion and ecology begins with an Islamic thinker. And what is the point that Nasr makes in Man and Nature, which moreover precedes the Lynn White article, Our Ecological Crisis, in which Lynn White criticizes religion and particularly Christianity for the environmental crisis, published prior to Man and Nature, but Nasr's lecture was given 6 months prior to the publication of Lynn White's article, and Lynn White was moreover in attendance of the Rockefeller lectures. All of these significant facts for addressing the history of religion and the environment, and particularly Islam and the environment. And in that lecture, Nasr puts forth, give a brief summary so that we know the history, obviously, of this field. A brief summary of what Nasser says. And there's so much more, but I'll highlight one salient point. Allow me to ask, when did and this is obviously a rhetorical question, we don't have participants responding, but why did the environmental crisis come about now? Why not in Mughal India? Why not in Buddhist Nepal? Why not in the different parts of the world that have showed civilizational genius, that have showed civilizational power? Why now? Well, through a study of the history of science, the history of philosophy, Nasser locates the roots in particularly the move from a sacred-centric paradigm, a paradigm in which the sacred is at the center, to an anthropocentric paradigm. Not necessarily in the sense that Ms. Kolkailah mentioned, because what Ms. Kolkailah had mentioned was an anthropocentric view located within a greater theocentric view within the Quran. But this is an anthropocentric framework that is defined by divorce from the herocentric, the sacred-centric, the theocentric. Humanism, Renaissance humanism, is by definition the move from theocentric to anthropocentric humanism. In this move, humanity, now the environmental crisis is now a global phenomenon, and the Islamic world participates in it as the West does, and not just the Islamic world, the Hindu world, Chinese, and so forth. But of course, historically, its origins are in the West, and in Western humanities at that point, in humanities denial of the sacred. Of course, you have like Christians who pray, who go to the mass, but of the sacred within the sciences, within the study of nature, within one's interactions with nature. In that denial of the sacred, that forgetting of the sacred, with Renaissance humanism, the move away from a sacred-centric view of the world, so comes the scientific revolution, the production of sciences, the birth of sciences that are no longer sacred-oriented. There's more that explains all of this, but I'm giving, in light of time restrictions, I'm only mentioning a few salient points. Again, the book that I had mentioned, Man and Nature, will give you a fuller history. But with sciences that are no longer restricted by the sacred, not ethically, nor epistemologically, seeing nature in light of her sacredness, no longer the vestigia Dei, the traces of the divine in nature. Suddenly, to use the Iliadian binary, nature moves from the sacred to the profane, where every point could have been a hierophany in an Iliadian sense. Now the world is profane fully. And from it comes a profane treatment of the environment. Again, in light of time, I'll have to move on. We also produced so the Religion, the Order of Nature, another significant book, which also, in light of, which echoes Quranic themes of recognizing the other, the religious other. Of course, as you know, the Quran mentions other prophets thoroughly, or maybe I shouldn't say thoroughly, but generally throughout the Quran. And Nasser himself also speaks to, highlights the order of nature according to Aboriginal frameworks, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu, and so forth. Also comes about a conference on religion and ecology headed by Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. And from that conference, the conference takes place at Harvard, and it's really a seminal conference. From that conference come conference proceedings in the form of a series of books. Rather, it's a series of conferences. The series is on religion and ecology, and each conference on a particular religion and ecology. And this is the Islam and Ecology conference proceedings, published by the Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard University Press, which is a significant moment within the Western study of Islam and nature, bringing together many different views of the topic, Islam and ecology, much rooted. You could see the Islamic inclination to root to root one's view of content and response to contemporary issues in scripture. You find it within this work and also in works that follow. Fazlun Khalid from England and others, Osman Bakar in Southeast Asia, Malaysia. Others have also written on this topic. There are more that one can mention, but I'm just highlighting particular points to give us a general outline of the map, general view of the map. Moving to the present, we have scholars who've written on Islam and the environment. Of them, Tariq Qadir, Traditional Islamic Environmentalism. The book is actually a summary of Nasser's views. The subtitle is The Vision of Sayyid Hussein Nasser, which essentially functions as a textbook introduction to the topic, to traditional Islamic environmentalism. And what Qadir does is he also brings Nasser's Man in Nature from the 60s into conversation with contemporary discourses, making the book relevant to us today in the face of, in responding to other discourses today that have come up since the publication of Man in Nature. And we also have from the UK, Sarah Tlili, Animals in the Quran, which surveys the exegetical, or according to four famous Sunni exegetes, the exegetical view of animals through the study of particular animal verses on animals, implied obviously by the word exegetical. And of course, we have on the topic of Islam and nature. Again, Nasser has works on science and Islam, science and civilization in Islam, as well as an introduction to Islamic cosmological doctrines. For the most part, this field has actually been built upon, or has been the works for the most part historically of one person, but fortunately, as you can see, there are also other people coming to the fore. I just mentioned Tariq Qadir, Sarah Tlili, Muhammad Abu Sayyim, also from Bangladesh, and who had just received his PhD in Hong Kong, is also another example of somebody, present-day scholar. I'll make very brief mention of myself, just to bring to light the work that I'm doing, to give you an idea of one more data point within this, within the field of Islamic environmentalism. My work is focuses there's an Islamic and a Christian dimension. I'm going to focus on the Islamic dimension. It begins with the Sahabi tree in Jordan, a tree considered traditionally to be the very same tree that once lowered its branches to give shade to the Prophet in his encounter with the Christian monk Bahira, or shortly before his encounter with the Christian monk Bahira. That tree still lives today, and by virtue of having responded to the Prophet, having interacted with it, is considered today a Sahabi. There's a documentary dedicated to it, to this tree, called The Blessed Tree. You can find it online on Al-Kimia and maybe some other online platforms. This tree, looking at this tree, I can ask, how is it that a tree can be considered a Sahabi? What Islamic traditions countenance regard for a tree as conscious, animate, being in devotional worship? And again, there's an Abrahamic religion. Within Western discourse, we do not usually associate Abrahamic religions with recognition of nature as alive. We associate that with, quote unquote, animism, obviously derogatory anthropological term to use to describe primal or indigenous religions. But here we're looking at an Abrahamic religion, and in my study, I come to find traditions that both complexify complicate a view of nature as animate, in the sense of ensouled and worshipping. But for the most part, I find much material that actually champions a view of nature as alive and as being in prayer. And I find this no more so in the writings of Jalaluddin Rumi, the Persian Sufi poet, whose Masnavi Ma'navi is considered in Persian to be a spiritual and poetic commentary on the Quran. And in short, everything is actually alive. Everything is alive, and I discussed this in my presentation in the seminar. I'm supposed to present it tomorrow, and the seminar associated with this lecture. For the sake of this particular lecture, I could present one point that I'll be mentioning in the seminar, which is that in reality, everything participates in consciousness, in life, and in prayer, even though we do not perceive it. And Rumi has an excellent explanation for why we do not perceive it, but suffice it to say that his view into the world really expounds Quranic verses such as يُسَبِّحُ لِلَّهِ مَنْ فِي السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, all that is within the heavens and the earth, glorify God. I'll move on from there. That's my research, to just look at the future, and in looking at the future, I have to just bring up one more dimension of the present that needs attention, because it will really because of its significant effect on the future, which is that. So it seems to me that the majority, I have not done formal research in this regard, not yet, but it seems to me that the majority of environmental work in the Islamic world of NGO work, NGO environmental work, is Western oriented, and this deserves investigation. Why is the majority of environmental work in the Islamic world, I mean explicitly environmental work, Western oriented? Does not the Islamic civilization have its own methods for responding to an ecological crisis? And of course, you do have attempts to revive the Hamad system, attempts to invoke Quranic verses that speak positively of the environment. But as I had said, tradition expounds over centuries what is there within a revelatory moment to bring to light its profundity for each generation. And having, in short, why are environmental institutions often Western oriented? Well, for one, it's the eclipse of tradition itself, including all of its sciences. You'll find, I mean, and this is non, it's an unquestionable point. You'll find many modern medical doctors in any Islamic city practically, but you won't find many who explicitly work with Avicennan medicine, obviously. The same with Islamic architecture. Now it's modern architecture, no longer Islamic architecture, and so forth. And with the eclipse of tradition, so goes the eclipse of Islamic ways of responding to problems. And now the Islamic world depends on the West for its response to the environmental crisis. And what we need to do is, in addition to trying to slow down the environmental crisis with Western means of responding to the environmental crisis, we really need, if we want an Islam and ecology, and Islam and nature, then we really need to turn to the Islamic tradition itself and to renew the tradition, to as Dr. Kravitz had said about Ms. Kolkailah's work, to breathe new life into what's there, and to decolonize the epistemological, to just decolonize epistemologies, knowledge that is, and the applications of knowledge, architecture, science, and so forth, to rediscover our own. I say our own, I myself, Jordanian, I'm Arab, Muslim, of course. And so I speak about the need of the civilization that I belong to, and also the need to do things, and these spoken of positively, just what I described, spoken of negatively, to push against an indifference towards a solution. That's it on my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Munjed. Thank you, Naiyerah. Thank you, Dr. Berget. Please, I say again to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to make use of the possibility of the Q&A box where you send your questions. We already started receiving some questions, but I don't know if we start. There is already a question directed to Naiyerah. Sorry, before we start with the questions, do you want to say something about what you have heard from your other colleagues? Any add up thoughts before we go to the questions?
I think they were both very, very insightful, and I think the history of environmentalism that Munjed brought up is really important in terms of the Western orientedness, and I think this idea of tapping into our tradition is very important, and reading in whether it be the Quran or fiqh or Sira and other disciplines to see to what extent we can apply what already exists to our current circumstances, I think is really important and much needed for all of us. So just a brief comment, so that's it.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Dr. Birgit, you want to say something before we move?
Rather not. I'm quite curious about the questions.
Okay. And Munjed, you want to say something? You were the last who spoke, but if you want to add anything, please.
I incorporated my responses in the lecture. Thank you.
Okay. I also noted some questions myself at the end of what I heard from you, but I will keep my questions to the very end. We'll give the opportunity to the audience. So we have here a question for Naiyerah. What can we derive from the description of gardens in Al-Jannah, in paradise, to our theocratic, anthropocentric, and ecological understanding of garden and practice of gardening? This is from Abayumi Sharumi.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think you may have meant theocentric. That was part of my presentation. But I think it's there's several things, and one is looking at the linguistic parallels. So the term that I specifically used was Jannat. Those are the two first stories had the word Jannat or Jannah in them. There's other words in the Quran that refer to gardens, Hada'iq, and other phrases, but specifically with the word Jannah, it's interesting that this shares a root with other words, Arabic words like jinn and janeen, fetus. So and you think about like what these words have in common. This concept or idea of being hidden or invisible. In the case of gardens, we can think of kind of the thick and intertwined dense foliage and canopies that make it difficult to see through or make out components from a distance. And this exists, obviously in Jannah, but as well as thinking about how we can design potentially these spaces that are thick in their foliage and canopies and that have that kind of similar effect. Of course, we know that the descriptions in Jannah are unparalleled in the sense that whatever we find in paradise is not is not earthly. It's not going to be as normal as what exists on earth. But I think this idea of possibly emulating paradisial descriptions that are celestial could be something in terms of how these gardens are designed. I think the other part of it is looking at the role of gardens in stimulating, senses, being a source of relaxation and a space for contemplation and enjoyment and healing and beauty and jamal. So, the descriptions of Jannat in the Quran give us a glimpse of that kind of purely blissful enjoyment, also in terms of the fruits and the food from whatever we desire, and low-lying fruits that can be picked easily, for example. So I think kind of what we do in and within these gardens can help us kind of long for and orient our lives in a way that leads to paradise, if you believe in that as someone who's a Muslim. And so and so I think there's other aspects in the Quran in terms of the description of حدائق ذات بهجة, فأنبتنا به حدائق ذات بهجة, so delightful and joy-inducing. So again, all these phrases, I think when it comes to us ourselves being within green spaces or designing these green spaces, I think we can draw a lot from the Quranic descriptions of paradise in the Quran. So
thank you. There is another question. Please, if you want to comment on questions, even if it's not directed to you, just let me know.
Yeah.
There is another question as a new. Yes, Dr. Berget, please.
Yeah, actually, I would like to quickly respond to the question that was not addressed to me. I mean, one could question why should one imitate paradise at all and not leave it to the later future? And for instance, one author, Hamad, Antila, in an edited volume, Roads to Paradise, he purports the thesis that paradise in the Quran is rather anthropocentric, and that the gardens are described in a way that implicitly, if not explicitly, take men at the center of interest. So one might question whether that is the utmost version of sustainability, and whether it is really necessary to implement that as a role model. Yeah, but
Is it the question that you want to answer, or is it a question that you raise, or?
no, I don't want to answer it. I'm just problematizing the question.
Okay. The question that we have been addressing already.
Yes. Yes, and may I also jump in?
Yes, yes, Munjed, please.
That's the question. So I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but Ms. Rian Tenveen had sent a message out to all panelists. I'm not sure if the audience can see this, but she had mentioned that the Quran is revealed to human beings as opposed to being revealed to other species. And in one sense, it is actually revealed to the whole cosmos. But that's a separate philosophical discussion I'll put to the side. For the most part, the description of heaven is actually speaking to humanity, and it might seem hedonistic, it might seem very obviously anthropocentric, but first of all, the hedonism is rather speaking to the sacred origin of pleasure in this world within the divine, that everything has a sacred origin to it, rather than heaven being this kind of amplification of worldly hedonism. And that there's essentially a sacred version of everything that's pleasurable. And then it seems anthropocentric is because it's speaking to human beings. And unlike particular, say, Christian views of paradise, which are in and of themselves just amazing to just try to imagine, the Islamic paradise has much more of nature within it, and is a paradise based on harmony. So it is certainly worth imitating in this world, emulating in this world, because yes, it is anthropocentric because it's speaking to human beings, like here's a reward, what it would look like, but it's, you know, salam and salama. It is a version based on harmony itself, and the highest of paradise is Jannat al-Dhat, of the divine essence, essentially a theocentric framework.
Thank you. There is here, I don't know, a remark or a question. As a new resident, I was wondering, it seems this is someone here in Qatar, Geoff Baker. As a new resident, I was wondering what work is currently being done to help address and remedy the greening of Qatar. We will begin to work with our students on modern composting and hydroponics strategies, and working with practices already being implemented. We hope will prove to be fruitful, as you mentioned, the divine balance. I think it's more of a comment. Would you like to say something, Naiyerah, about this?
Yes, I think there's a follow-up also about what roadblocks stand in the way for environmental reform from truly taking off in this region, especially Qatar. Seems that the Quran offers amazing insights and incentive to help the culture get on board with going green. So interesting, my doctoral dissertation actually focuses on environmentalism in Qatar from an Islamic perspective. And I mean, just having done field work there, I mean, in terms of just observation, there are numerous projects, you know, adding public and neighborhood parks, things like that. Water is you know, scarce, so water scarcity is an issue in terms of you know, going completely green, but I think there's potential for gray or recycled water to be used in these green spaces, and I think that's something that's already happening in multiple places. Related to the obstacles of for environmental reform, I think one of the biggest roadblocks is environmental awareness and education. So many people aren't actually aware of environmental issues, risks, vulnerabilities, and the value of environmental pursuits in the region and for the rest of the world. So I think, I mean, just recognizing that we live in a deeply interconnected world, you know, and that what our environmental behavior locally, you know, affects the region and affects other people in the world. And so there's a number of groups working on this in Qatar, but I think we need more organized efforts, you know, in-person forums, utilizing social media, you know, grassroots organizations, things like that. You know, using whatever tools are within reach, and starting, I think, with raising environmental awareness to advocate both environmental literacy and Islamic religious literacy, because I think those need to go hand in hand, especially tapping into our Islamic moral tradition and highlighting where, you know, environmental responsibility plays a huge role in the tradition. I think that could be a great opportunity to mobilize people from their existing culture and their frame of reference. I think indigenous environmentalism is something that's really important to mobilize and you know, activate. And I think we need more of these efforts, especially that, as you know, Munjed was saying too, in terms of a lot of the environmental advocacy and initiatives are kind of imported in terms of the models, in terms of the focus, in terms of the secular approach, and not rooting it within the Islamic tradition. So,
thank you. There is a question, should the corporate sectors need to have different standards in reporting for ESG? I don't know what's this ESG elements, especially when they touch on Islamic Sharia compliance requirements.
I think I can
Any thoughts about this?
Yes, I think that's environmental social governance, and I think it's
okay.
Related to externalities and related to you know, the things that aren't accounted for within business and financial activities. And I think I just want to say that I think every sector and segment in society has a role to play, you know, in kind of genuinely transforming, you know, especially for businesses, economic practices, and to consider the environmental, you know, externalities and the issues that aren't normally factored in with economic activities, and to genuinely transform from kind of within the model. And of course, there's, I mean, the economic issues are a whole nother you know, issue that we can talk about, but in terms of at least within a corporation to change their own, you know, model, the way they operate, in terms of not just pursuing financial growth irrespective of the effect on the environment and the local situation on the ground. So,
okay, thank you. There is a question, more than one phrase from Sir Firaz Ilahi. How do actions equate themselves towards verses? And then mentions 17, chapter 17, verse 88, gathering to not even being able to produce a surah. And then the verse, chapter 22, verse 73, in creating even a fly or take something away from it. And then chapter 33, verse 72, and the unknowing this of the trust, we did indeed offer the trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they refused to bear it, being afraid thereof. But man undertook it. He was indeed unjust and ignorant. Maybe Munjed, you want to comment on that?
To be honest, I did not fully understand the question itself, but how can actions respond to these or be informed by these verses?
I think so. It's not very clear also to me, but I think that's the point. The point is that about the trust offered to the heavens and earth, they did not accept, but the man accept. So it seems that this put responsibility on the man for action, doing more action or something, if I understood well.
So what I'll say for now is, and also echoing something that Dr. Kravitz had said, which is that much of and it seems that the seminar associated with this lecture is aiming towards this. Much of the discussion in Islam and the environment popularly has been very superficial, in that in the attempt to respond to environmental issues, we try to find the Quranic verse and use that to respond, which is actually which makes sense and is worth doing, but our actions, these verses are pertinent. They're very important, and I thank Sir Firaz Ilahi for mentioning them. But the attempt to respond to something as intricate as an environmental crisis with just reference to Quranic verses is not enough, because these Quranic verses are very, very, very deep. They're very they're polyvalent, they're multivalent, and what we are in need of are sciences that actually have flowered from these verses, that have put these verses into action. Me reading one verse of Quran and then trying to go and act is a good thing, but on a civilizational level, we're in need of traditions that have developed as a result of these verses. And so, for example, with the question posed to Ms. Kolkailah, how do we green Qatar, that dimension of the question, it's not just enough to say, oh, the Quran says we're khulafa, so let's be khulafa, let's take care of the environment. It's not enough, because how do you take care of the environment? And there's a Quranically rooted tradition of, say, architecture that takes care of the environment along with doing many other things. And it's not just something of the past. Hassan Fathi in Egypt has built a whole, he's recently passed away, but he has his students who continue to build, has built a whole village, a whole like a whole city practically, that's traditional thoroughly and that can function within the modern world. We have these opportunities, and it's not enough to just look at a Quranic verse and try to act, but we have to turn to the sciences that themselves are rooted within the Quranic verses, so that we can actually respond to the intricate problem of ecological crisis.
There is another question for you, Munjed, from Sami Ad-Darstani. It's about the work of Sayyid Hussein Nasr. The work of Sayyid Hussein Nasr, he says, is pioneering as it has been within the context of Islamization of knowledge, inform a critical discussion on the very nature of the field of environmental ethics in Islam, since Islamization of knowledge has been conceptualized as a reconciliation between Islam and modernity. So he sees that there is a kind of contradiction. So the Islamization of knowledge is about reconciliation. Sayyid Hussein Nasr work on environmental ethics does not see that, it seems.
Yeah, so Islamization of knowledge is I'm not sure if it's a technical term, because I see that Mr. Dagestani uses IOK. So it might be a technical term, one that I'm not really familiar with, but I think I can gather what's happening. So Nasr is responding, I mean, to my knowledge, I mean, I can't speak for him, but from my understanding of his works, is that he's responding to, first of all, the secularization of knowledge. The secularization of knowledge that comes from the secularization of civilization from the West and now into the Islamic world. And in doing so, he's not providing an Islamization of knowledge in the sense of, again, what Dr. Kravitz had criticized, and rightly so, this tafsir al-ilmi, which is very superficial. This kind of like, oh, there's a reference in the Quran to like something, this scientific theory, we could find a precedent for it within the Quran. Oh, look, how can somebody in the desert, an Ummi in the desert 1,400 years ago say this? like clearly this is revelational, which has some aspect to it, trying to point towards the mu'jizat of the Quran, but it's very superficial, and it's trying to take modern scientific theories and provide an Islamic version of the scientific theory without actually really fully understanding the scientific theory nor the Islamic sciences themselves. Rather, we have Nasr responds to a secularization of, it seems to me, two things: knowledge and its applications. Knowledge within the Islamic world was, for the most part, intimately intertwined with the sacred. You know, what are the clergymen of the Islamic tradition called? They're called ulama. You know, knowledge is central over here. Perhaps the only thing that the Prophet asks increase of within the, or is told to ask increase of in the Quran is ilm. Rabbi zidni ilma. It's central. And what was his name? Franz Rosenthal has this excellent book on the Islamic civilization as a civilization based on knowledge, knowledge triumphant. What we're in need of is, according to Nasr, this move away from the secularization of knowledge, because the Islamic tradition does not function with a secularization of knowledge. In fact, what you're doing then is you're just eclipsing the tradition and replacing it with some secular form. Knowledge and its applications, that is the sciences, the architectures, and so forth, the traditional craftsmanship.
Thank you. One of our colleagues, Dr. Din Mohammed, just commented saying that the writings of Sayyid Hussein Nasr on environmental ethics is they are pioneering and significant, although some people try to marginalize them nowadays. There is a question from Ali Bak, just trying to add to the discussion about anthropocentric perspective in the Quran, etc. He says, if I may add a point related to Quran being directed at humanity, there is a chapter in the Quran entitled Surah Al-Jinn, chapter of Jinn, where it is mentioned the story of the jinn that heard from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, reciting the Quran, and the discussion they had where they discussed how they reacted to previous revelations. While jinn is a large topic, possibly not related to our topic now, this is, in a sense, does expand the conversation and our responsibility as vicegerents of Earth. So says that we have an evidence. He says that Quran is directed not only to humans. There is a question to Munjed. You mentioned the Persian poet Rumi and his Mathnawi in your talk in regards to environmental issues. Can you please clarify the change in the ethical way of presenting poetry by Arab poets, both in Arabian barren deserts and after moving to Al-Andalus, in regards to the natural environment? This is from Omar Dawhu.
It's a very good question. I'm sorry to say that I do not know the answer, but it's a very good question.
Okay, I think there should be some shifts, moving from desert-based nature to green-based nature. There should be something, but this may need some research. There was a question to Naiyerah asking about what kinds of Islamic gardens are there, what are the different characteristics of the Mughal gardens, Kashmiri gardens, Ottoman gardens, etc.
That's a very vast question. Yes.
About that.
Yes. So, I mean, the literature on Islamic gardens is quite extensive, and there's a lot of, studies done on the parallels, similarities, differences. And one of the kind of models that's highlighted a lot as part of what is considered, which I problematize also in my paper in terms of the traditional or typical Islamic garden, is the what's known as the charbagh, which is like a quadripartite, four-part structure with a stream or a pool in the middle, and so that existed in certain areas in the Mughal gardens, Persian gardens, but it's not necessarily something that is standard across all the gardens. And I think it's important to consider the different, issues that contribute to the formation of the gardens in terms of the existing cultures, in terms of the topography, the geography. For example, in mountainous areas, you're going to have a different approach to irrigation where the water needs to be brought from the mountains versus if a garden, for example, is near a river, that's going to look different. And so, the scholars talk about the different features of these gardens. That's more of kind of an architectural approach. And what I was trying to do is focusing on, again, the ethical potential of these gardens, which I think they can go hand in hand in terms of focusing on the aesthetic aspects, and then at the same time focusing on the function and form that they can, take in order to serve a certain benefit for the living communities that are within the region. So I think that's an important focus that I wanted to highlight. I think, sorry, there was another question we may have missed related to khatibs and imams. I just kind of wanted to address that, if that's okay.
I didn't see.
Yes, that's okay. I think it's a really great point. In order for us to raise environmental awareness to the level of the masses, I think the imams and khatibs play a big role in that they serve as a link between the people and the scholars. And some of the imams can also be scholars themselves. But I think that because, environmental issues are so interdisciplinary, I think it's very important to tap into the expertise within so many different fields in terms of how to even think about going about creating trainings for imams that can be, produced in collaboration between ethicists and environmentalists and scientists and environmental planners. I think a whole host of expertise and experts need to be involved in what could be considered something that could be offered to imams and khatibs and people who address the locals on a regular basis within classes and masajid and weekly khutbahs and things like that, to produce something that not only educates the people from, again, within the Islamic tradition and on the current science and the current environmental vulnerabilities and how to have a more harmonious relationship with the environment, but again, rooting it within the Islamic tradition, but also being able to put that into practice individually and then also collectively as a community and within the broader society. So I think that's definitely an important point, and a lot of thought needs to go into that within the communities. And it's going to take people who are environmentally aware to approach their masajid and their organizations to, ensure that something like that happens and to recruit the people that are required to put that into effect. So,
thank you. There is a question here. I think it's more relevant to Dr. Kravitz, if you want to comment on it, about the concepts and language used in the field. It's from Ilyas Mechkor. I'm inspired by the call to create more Islamic concepts language to address environmental issues. Many of these concepts are secular and lack moral, ethical values. Are there more value-driven alternatives to the SDGs or secular economy? I want to take this question into the direction of what you mentioned in your talk, Dr. Kravitz, about paying attention to the context. When we use certain concepts, you refer to qist, mizan, etc., and whether these concepts can be directly taken over from there to mean something in that. So in general, about the issue of concepts, language, terminology, and how far the secular / Islamic or religious say it's a load of these terms could contribute to improving the field of environmental ethics in the Islamic tradition.
Yes, I think it is the design of this workshop not to start with European language concepts that are related to NGOification like Anthropocene and the like, but we do take a look at emic Islamic concepts, and my argument was that we perhaps put too much emphasis in theological pride and elevated concepts like Mizan, Tawheed, and then we get on the high bandwagon of Islamic theology, but we should look for critical concepts. And I think one way of criticizing certain contexts could be provided more precisely by Islamic jurisprudence, but I have the impression that a return to the strong maslahization of the 20th century is not going to provide a solution, because it is what I think Leo Halavi has called it laissez-faire maslaha or maqasidism. And we might perhaps revert to concepts hitherto overlooked, and I'm especially referring to the usul al-fiqh principle of sad al-dhara'i'. So sad al-dhara'i', I think, has a very bad press, because it is prominently related of the prohibition for women to drive cars. But since this prohibition has been lifted recently, I think it's now time to move on to a green resuscitation of sad al-dhara'i' that enables people to not only declare things as forbidden that have been marked as forbidden in the holy sources of Islam, but to take the context and the results of a certain behavior and its future results into account. So I do want to see doctoral theses from these Markaz Dirasat at-Tashri'ah that are all over the world and close by in Qatar, who work on a green reading of Sad al-Dhara'i', for instance. Yeah, and I do have a quick remark concerning the Imams and Khatibs. I'm wondering where those Ibn al-Jawzis are from the 12th century. I mean, we heard that a preacher like Ibn al-Jawzi managed, or people were weeping in the thousands in his weekly sermons. So I do want to see these figures to re-emerge with the green agenda. And I have also a quick remark about the green verses of the Quran. A good repository, so to speak, I think, is the monograph by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Ri'ayat al-Bi'a fi Sharia al-Islamiyya. That's basically a thick repository of verses and hadith material. But that, again, does not contain, to my taste, enough fiqh solutions that we could follow up on.
Thank you. I just want to give a quick comment about the Sadd al-Dhara'i'. I think we have, besides Sadd al-Dhara'i', the slippery slope principle, or the blocking the means to evil, we also have the opening the means to good things, Fath al-Dhara'i'. So it all depends on how you use them and when exactly, and for which issues. There is a question here, a general big one, how Islamic environmentalism may respond to COVID-19 as a global emergency and global environment change. This is from Rashid Khalil. Any thoughts about this, the response to COVID-19 as a global emergency and global environment change?
Didn't you organize a conference about that? I think you should respond to that question, right?
I'm happy to. I'm happy to. I just don't see the point that COVID-19 pandemic is a global environment change. It's a pandemic, and we have seen cycles of pandemics throughout history, even at times when we were not that cruel towards the environment. So they happened before. But yes, we organized a number of events related to the COVID-19. Our summer school in 2020 was about Islamic ethics of pandemics and COVID-19. And we started an MA course in our program, Applied Islamic Ethics. We have an MA program in Applied Islamic Ethics in the College of Islamic Studies. And this summer school was about the vaccination ethics in the COVID-19 context. So we said so much about these issues through these events. I cannot imagine that we can, I can give like a capsule or something about the Islamic response to COVID-19. There are so many issues. Some of the issues had to do with the rituals, how to do the religious rituals, like the congregational rituals, in particular, the closure of mosques, the suspension of congregational prayers. Some of the issues had to do with vaccination and the vaccination hesitancy as a phenomenon among some Muslims and how to respond to these issues. Talks and discussions of these events are already available or will be available soon on our website, on CILE website, where you can have a look and see on them. But I don't want to take the time of the speakers to speak about an issue which is not really relevant, but I have directed you to the sources. There should be videos from these events available. And by the way, we are preparing also a thematic issue on Islamic ethics of pandemics and COVID-19 for the Journal of Islamic Ethics. We published a call for papers, and we have received already some papers. Some of them are in the advanced publications that you can see them on the website. Hopefully next year, the thematic issue will be available. So this is from my side.
May I also jump in?
Yes, please.
Two things come to mind in response to Dr. Rashid Khalil's question. The first is, fortunately, the coronavirus gave nature a break, a moment to breathe, with our lessening of human activity. But in another sense, to my mind, actually, coronavirus is proving detrimental to the environment, because what it's done for humanity, for the majority of humanity, is that it's taken us into virtual reality. Where now meetings, classes, I teach classes on the computer as opposed to in person. Our meetings are in person, or right now this conference is virtual. And fortunately, we didn't all have to fly over to Qatar and put so much more gas into the air. But unfortunately, the human psyche is being pulled further into the virtual environment. And nature does not reside within the virtual environment. Nature resides within the corporeal environment. And I think that the further we get sucked into our computers and our phones and into virtual reality, the more that it will cost nature here in the physical world. And then second to that, it's worth mentioning, I think there are these great commentaries, Islamic commentaries on the coronavirus. Two come to mind. Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, Dr. TJ Winter from Cambridge University, and the Cambridge Muslim College has an excellent reflection on the coronavirus from particularly an Islamic perspective. It's on YouTube, and it feels like it's like a kind of a moment of reflection for the Islamic world, really, in the words that he puts it. I highly recommend it. And then also, ironically, I mentioned him because I had just mentioned him earlier, but also Sayyid Hussein Nasr has an excellent interview with a rabbi on the coronavirus that really speaks to, I think, the heart of Islamic teachings in response to the pandemic, in response to the coronavirus.
Thank you. I think one of the good things also for that this pandemic brought is realizing how important gardens are. Everyone who had a garden, they discovered the garden, they started working on the garden because they couldn't go anywhere else. And those who didn't have realized that it's not good to have a house without a garden. So one of the relevant things now, I have even heard that houses with gardens, the prices get much higher than normal because people realize that it's not luxury, they need it. And who knows what will happen in the coming years. So it became like part of the necessities, not anymore part of the luxuries, became part of daruriyat, not part of al-tahsiniyat. Okay, I think we covered the questions and we are approaching the end of the time. So I will not give myself the right to ask my questions and to keep you talking all the time, but I want to give you the opportunity if you have any final thoughts, a message or something that you want to say before we bring this session or this event to conclusion. Who would like to start? Naiyerah, shall we start in the same order? Naiyerah, would you like to say something as a conclusion?
Sure, inshallah. I just want to reiterate one of the points I mentioned during the presentation and during the Q&A in terms of framing the discussion kind of or debate between, you know, anthropocentrism and ecocentrism in hierarchical terms, and that's a tendency to happen. And we can, rather than doing so, tie it to the centrality of the human position, you know, to tying that centrality to the notions of responsibility and duties and service. And providing, you know, benefit. I think that's so important to other living creatures, you know, as opposed to thinking kind of we're the most superior or exalted creatures. And so, again, you know, it's important to not just focus on, you know, erecting buildings in terms of fulfilling this idea of khilafa and i'mar, but serving God, bringing people closer to Allah's creation and signs and establishing these very fundamental values of equity and justice and mercy and peace on earth. So,
thank you. Dr. Birgit?
Yeah, I think it is important to realize how many emotions are involved in these debates about the environment. To start with, when we talk about the paradise, but also when environmental action is demanded from people who are angry about the impact of Western colonialism for centuries, and people who are now asked to stop their behavior and be attentive to green imperatives, and also the role of emotions that are important for the mobilization of new publics to become enthusiastic about the green project. So it might not be sufficient to offer collective waste practices and things like that, but a broader action concerning the emotions and to get more people on board. And I myself would not be enthusiastic about too many ideological announcements, but I would be really enthusiastic about closer development or analysis of the conceptual history of certain terms and their conceptual applications. That's it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Munjed?
Thank you. I guess I'll just respond to this just to support what has been said concerning an anthropocentric versus a theocentric paradigm. Humanity is created ahsan taqweem, but also has the possibility of being asfal safilin. And that's the unique status of the unique character of humanity, this ability to rise and fall throughout the chain of being, so to speak. And it's only the saints who are really at the height, and others below. And Ibn al-Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, says, insofar as humanity, like the al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human being, rotates around God, so does the whole cosmos rotate around him. So ultimately a theocentric view, and the function of Khalifa is to attach oneself to the divine, and then as a Khalifa fil ard, so does the divine then serve as a bridge towards the world, independent of all the bridges that the natural phenomena have, but as a central bridge to the world, to the divine, between the world of the divine. And thank you very much for hosting this seminar. Thank you, Dr. Kravitz and Dr. Ghaly.
Thank you so much for the three of you, and thanks a lot for the audience who have engaged with your thoughts and your ideas, and for having such an interactive session and discussions with them. I also want to thank my colleagues at CILE who have been working very hard to make this happen. And I would like to say that we are looking very much to having the audience in future events. Our center is quite busy, research center. We have every now and then events. You can always follow us on our website, kilecenter.org. Our social media, we have a YouTube channel, we have Twitter account, we have Facebook account. You can always follow us. We have the plans now. The closest plan is we will have a research seminar on Maqasid al-Sharia and ethics, which is supposed to take place by the end of November, beginning of December. You will hear about this also on the website. We will have a public lecture like the one we have here. Next year, we have a couple of research seminars already planned now. One on the concepts of good and evil, theological ethics, and one on political ethics, state and public morality, by external researchers like we did with Dr. Birgit here. And we hope to have you and to get you involved in all these forthcoming events. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening or the rest of the day, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Yeah.